Hi, I'm Alex. I'm from JSTOR Labs. Over the past 45 minutes, hour, we've heard a lot of great examples of digital humanities as a tool for engaging with students, as a scholarly practice. And what I'm going to take a sort of a different approach and talk about it as a way to talk about how an aggregator or a publisher can apply the tools and methods of digital humanities into scholarly communications. I think there are some great parallels, and I'll show you some examples, and we'll do it pretty quickly so we can get to a conversation. We don't need to go through that stuff. Ithaca, JSTOR, blah, blah, blah. JSTOR Labs, for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we build experimental tools for research and teaching. Check us out. I'll show you a couple of our stuff. Come talk to me if you have questions. But that's what we do. We build these experimental tools. But one way that I've increasingly been thinking about what we do is that we're essentially an applied digital humanities shop. And I hadn't really heard that term. I don't know if it's a term that other people use, but I've increasingly sort of realized that that's what we do, is we apply the digital humanities in the same way that an applied sciences shop would apply new scientific methods. To describe that, to take a cue from Etienne, I'm going to simplify things and get real kind of dumb, because that's just how I think. So that went the wrong way. So this is a scholar. He's a humanist. And humanists ask a series of questions about the world. They interrogate texts, they interrogate cultural artifacts or our history. That's what a humanist does. And a digital humanist essentially does the same thing. They're asking questions, but instead of using the tools and methods that have existed, they have new tools. And but they're still asking many of the same questions. But what happens is, as they're using these new tools, suddenly they can ask, their questions can extend, and they can ask larger questions and engage in different ways. For example, engaging with text and data mining, if a literature professor who can historically read 1 to 20 texts can suddenly read an entire library. And the questions that are being asked are still humanistic questions about understanding who we are and how we think and how we act, but they're using different tools and engaging with content differently. It's not the transactional book-by-book interaction. It is more about corpora. And my suggestion is that there's a parallel between that and how publishers operate. This is a fine little picture of Benjamin Franklin as a printer. Printers and publishers historically have curated and crafted each text that they're working with. And and then even if they're thinking about a number of texts, it's still a curated publisher's list. And even an aggregator like JSTOR, we care a lot about every single text and article, and then the interactions that our users have with JSTOR are transactional. They want a PDF. In fact, they're little PDF-seeking missiles. That's just what what users are. But I think one of the things that I think we can learn from digital humanists as publishers, as we've been curating this, we've created corpora with our decades and centuries of publications that are worthy of interrogation and have value that is greater than the sum of their individual parts. We can extract knowledge from each of those corpora. And that's what JSTOR Labs has been trying to do with JSTOR. So I think I got ahead of myself with the slides here. So this is Ben Franklin. There we go. And yeah, okay, good. So what I'm going to do next is, I think, as we apply the tools of digital humanities to scholarly communications, 4 themes will emerge, and I'm going to flash these up here really quickly, and then we'll come back to them after I show you some examples of what we've done. But let's just to tell them what you're going to tell them. The 4 themes are that we're leveraging technologies in productized interactions. I'll explain what that means. It's kind of jargony, I apologize. Embracing partnerships and multidisciplinarity, embracing experimentation and iteration, and embracing openness and transparency. And these themes are ones that you already heard from some of the other speakers on this panel. Okay, but let me show you a couple of the, and I'll show that again, that slide again in a little bit. And I'll also share these slides on Twitter and blah, blah, blah if they're interesting. Okay, so let me show you some examples. And as I do, I'll try to highlight and come back to some of those themes. First one is Shakespeare, right? So I'm going to show you 3 examples, understanding Shakespeare, topic graph, and text analyzer. Is that good? Can you see it? Good. Okay, so Understanding Shakespeare was a partnership with the Folger Shakespeare Library. The way that JSTOR Labs, we do a lot of our projects as partnerships. The way we approach those partnerships is open and collaborative. We don't know before we go in what we're going to build. It's more like a play date. We decide, hey, let's go play in that sandbox. You bring your toys, we'll bring ours. Folger had these great digital editions of their texts. Anybody want to call out a play that we want to dive into? Tempest, I like it. Where'd it go? There we go. So they had these great digital editions of their texts, and JSTOR obviously has a lot of scholarship about them. And so what we were able to do, and we knew we wanted to explore how the two could come together and connecting them. So what you see here are next to each line is a number. These are the number of articles in JSTOR that quote each specific line of the text. So for what cares these roars for the name of the king to cabin silence, there are 12 articles. Some of them get up to 700 in Hamlet especially. And then you can highlight, if you're searching, you can highlight and cover and see where, how they're quoting, and then dive into the article. So it's a new way of doing research on Shakespeare. We're actually now expanding this project into understanding great works. We'll have an entire collection of British literature and the King James Bible, and that'll be released probably later this summer. That'll extend on this. Part of this, there's an API where scholars and and people who have a DH bent can build their own visualizations and discovery methods on top of these tools. So that's the first tool. Second one, we'll do it here. Which one was it? Topic graph. So this was part of a project that we did as part of reimagining the monograph. We were exploring new ways of exploring long-form digital argument. And for this one, we were trying to highlight and find new ways of understanding what was within a book, especially when you're in a digital world where all you get is MARC records or card catalogs, and it's really hard to navigate. And so what this is we used a method called topic modeling, which does as a mathematical natural language processing analysis to understand what a topic is about. So it looks at this book, which is, I think, a Cornell book. Yep. Algorithmically figures out the main topics that appear within the book, and then graphs where they occur within the topic. I've heard this called, I think on Twitter, somebody called it if a index and a topic graph had index and a table of contents had a really attractive baby, this would be it. So you can see as you dive in, you can see if I'm interested in the publishing industry, which many of us in this room probably are. All the words associated with publishing industry are highlighted. So it's not just the term. A topic is composed of a number of terms, the likelihood the combination of which suggests that this topic is being addressed. So that allows us to pick up latent topics when, for example, a term hasn't been invented yet or is just being implied. And you can browse directly to the thing that you're most interested in and see them highlighted. The last example that I'll show is something called text analyzer. This uses some of the same technologies as topic graph, uses a topic model as well, but to a different end. So rather than showing people what is within a document, it looks at a document and then finds other documents that are similar. So in this case, I'm just going to take the example, which is from an article in JSTOR Daily, a magazine that JSTOR has. This is on Victorian microscopes and the enchanted world. And what it does is it reads the paper, figures out the topics and entities that it's about, and then uses those terms to find articles in JSTOR that are about the same thing. And then if I'm a user, I can adjust that by dragging and dropping, by adjusting, I'm interested in fantasy world or not in philosophy of religion, and filter in any number of ways, and it'll adjust the results. This is to encourage users to see their search results not as a set of individual topics that individual documents for them to engage with one at a time, but as a corpus in and of itself that they can actively manipulate and engage with. We've now also extended this so that it is multilingual. So if you upload a German document, we have a German topic model, so it figures out in German what the document is about, and then it translates those top articles into those top terms into English and finds related English language content. So it's multilingual search without having to do translation, algorithmic translation, which is kind of messy, of the main documents, which is pretty nifty. Okay, let me get back to the PowerPoint. Did that work? It worked. Isn't that nice? Okay, so let's return to our 4 themes, and I'll try to highlight some examples from those. So first of all, leverage technologies and productized iteration interactions. I don't know. So first of all, JSTOR Labs, we tend not to create new technical innovations. We're using topic modeling and natural language processing, and Shakespeare used fuzzy text matching. We use GIS on projects that I haven't shown you. We're not doing those kinds of technical innovations. We're seeing what's out there and then applying them in new ways, not to showcase the technology. In fact, you can see the technology in most of these instances is sort of under the covers. Instead, we're productizing it. We're focusing it very much on a specific user need that will allow them to do something new. And that's something that publishers do all the time. They think about, how do I productizing, taking knowledge and turning it into something that users can really benefit from. So that's essentially what we're doing, is we're productizing these innovations and sharing them. The embrace of partnerships and multidisciplinarity. Now, JSTOR is obviously inherently multidisciplinary, but this as an approach to partnership and as an approach to business development, we have interacted with any number of people in organizations. I'm doing a project now with the Library of Congress on baseball, and it's exciting and thrilling to engage in that sort of way, and you can do a lot more when it's not just you working on something. I didn't really talk too much in this about experimentation and iteration, but every single one of those projects, well, none of those projects sprung fully formed from my head or the people who are much smarter than me in the JSTOR Labs team. They were all achieved by thousands of tiny iterations. So for example, in the topic graph project, that project took a month to build. We started it in October, and we were basically done a month later at Columbia. And it was all achieved by doing 1,000 tiny iterations. So these are the sketches that occurred along the way. So this is day 1, day 2, day 5, day 7. And at each step, we're testing with users, we're testing for feasibility with our technologists to see what can fly. And that hypothesis-driven development is really important and allows us to do exciting stuff. The last theme is around openness and transparency. All of our projects are open. We try to make our content as open as possible. JSTOR has content that much of our content is access to JSTOR. So we make that is available for registration. About 80% of the content is available for free with registration. That's a metered access. But all of the tools themselves, the code is open and available. And also we try to expose through APIs and other methods the data that's powering the algorithms as much as possible. So for example, and I forgot to show this, in Text Analyzer, if you hover over any result, it'll give you the rationale for why that result is appearing and why it's appearing in that particular location. And that's because in digital humanities, they want to see within the black box. You can't just take something as a given that it's happening. That Google black box is a very scary thing. And you need, if you're actually doing analysis, you need that information. And that's vital. So with that, I'll thank you. And I guess we'll have questions for all of us.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating set of presentations. We have a little bit less time than I thought, so let's dive right in. Anybody have any questions for our panelists? Sorry.
Hi, Mary Rose Musi from Temple University Press. So digital humanities projects are obviously based on scholarship, but more and more we're seeing them extending scholarship and being the foundation for additional scholarship, and they become part of the formal scholarly record. So my question is, there's preservation, and then there, as we heard about at Yale, then there's format migration, allowing ongoing access, maintaining this critical part of the scholarly record. Some people use their DH for tenure and promotion purposes. And I'm wondering, this is beyond putting something in an institutional repository. This is ongoing care and feeding, and I just wonder how you all are addressing that.
Well, in our case at Yale, it was fairly early recognition in the library, especially, that we could not continue in a siloed approach. Emile is my example. There were, I think our spreadsheet got up to about 80 siloed projects on campus, and that's when digital collections and sitting down to decide what the look and feel would be, how to manipulate various indices, all sorts of decisions like that happened. That beyond sustainability in the technical or financial sense, we had a responsibility to make sure if a scholar used our project in 2005, that the scholar should be able to find that resource in 2018. And I think bringing in, it's written on Sterling, on the building, the library is the heart of the university. So fortunately, the library decision to bring that approach, bring silos in under an umbrella and continue in that way.
So I would add, so for our publishing initiative, the Illinois Open Publishing Network and Publishing Without Walls, we do have a preservation policy, and we commit to preserving the intellectual content of the work. So, especially with multimedia sites like Scalar and Omeka, we recognize that it is very tough to preserve those. And they're not going to go down anytime soon, but, we're looking at, web preservation. We have a fairly robust web archiving unit in our preservation, but we also think, from starting with the author right at the beginning, what formats are you using? Are those formats that we can easily export and migrate out? And just having that conversation with them from the beginning, and then committing with both our research data repository, our digital preservation repository, thinking about what are the core parts that we're preserving while keeping the website, the active website, as long as possible. So it's an ongoing conversation, and as technologies change, we recognize that we may have new approaches as well.
I'll add one little thing. I think for the JSTOR Labs team, we engage with projects in a different way. We're not actually creating scholarship, for example. I will say we're very clear, just to build on what Harriet was saying just now, we have two kinds of projects. We have discovery projects and incubation projects. So there are kinds of projects where we're exploring new territory and we don't know whether we're actually going to do something valuable. And for those, we make no claims and obligations to maintain them, even if they're bright and shiny and new. Whereas the incubation projects, we are asserting that they will be around for some time and that people that, people who are teaching research methods will be able to depend upon them. So it has to do with being able to signal our intention, being able to be clear the extent to which we're willing to commit to their ongoing value. And that has to do with whether or not they're giving value yet.
Hi, Greg Taylor, ATLA. Thank you for some great presentations. My question is something you guys touched on in most of your presentations, which is the legal question of securing copyright, licensing permissions for that sort of content. That's obviously a difficult thing to do, and there's no magic way to make it easy, but I'm curious what sort of resources you work with when you're questioning or thinking about the legal strategy there. Do you work with the legal department of your university? Do you bring somebody on board to your core DH team, or are they a reference, or just some sense of the mechanics by which you kind of try to navigate those waters? Thanks.
So I'll start. So we have a copyright librarian on access material staff who work with all the authors as they're starting to think through what resources they're using. The authors themselves, we don't provide legal services, so the authors themselves have to seek permissions and copyright, but we do provide advisory for that, and we try to encourage, of course, open access materials whenever possible.
About 3/4 of the way through, Emil, the library added a part-time copyright librarian who has a JD as well as an MLS. When we started, Emil, as I mentioned, the motivation was to go with academic journals, thinking there's not as much financial competition, it would be easier. Our curator literally traveled through the Middle East, one publisher after the other, cajoled, took people out for coffee, lunch, went back, came back, went back again, finally to get the first 7 copyright agreements. We worked also with the legal advisors at the Biblioteca Alexandrina, because copyright is so different amongst Middle East countries, and we contracted a copyright firm in DC to review everything that we had done and come up with a position paper. Were we at risk? What was it, high, medium, or low? Because of the target of Yale being so large, we wanted to make sure that we were managing risk as well.
Hi, I'm Mike Taylor. I'm head of metrics at Digital Science, and I'm also an amateur archaeologist. A number of you talked about the issues of economic sustainability, and Gabrielle in particular mentioned the importance of demonstrating the value to funders to ensure further rounds of support and funding. So I'm very interested in how you integrate the two kinds of user data, if you like, into those reports back to funders and so forth. In particular, for example, with Harriet's project, there seemed to me that there are two things that you could do to measure the effectiveness of the work that you do. Clearly, your work is primarily concerned with sustainably publishing digital humanities material. But you've got two issues with digital humanities particularly. You've got the wide lay public who are consumers who are interested and engaged with humanities. You've also got scholarly usage. So you've got like non-scholarly usage to track and engagement, and you've also got scholarly engagement with citations and art abstracts and indices and references and so on. And I'm really interested about how you balance those two things and prepare that data for reporting back to people to improve your sustainability.
Sure, I can start, and Gabe may jump in. So yes, that's a thing that we've been looking at from the beginning, and that's actually, we have a research study kind of running alongside with PWW, and part of it is looking at what are metrics for open access publications. How do we track that? How do we start thinking about that beyond, because we don't have sales. So right now we're using Google Analytics to track the basic web analytics of hits and users and views, where people are coming from. We're also looking into installing either Altmetric or Plum XE. He's had analytics, sure, all those different interactions, whether Twitter, social media, citations, government documents, et cetera. But also, you know, as authors go out there, the author of the Jay-Z mixtape, I mean, he's done extensive publicity. He had a launch at a barbershop. He's done all sorts of podcasts, interviews. So kind of capturing all the things that he's doing in terms of that. And for scholarly usage, we have, well, both for scholarly and lay usage, we have the DOIs. And so the DOI, assigning DOIs to all our books helps us capture a lot of those metrics. But it's an ongoing conversation. And at each report, we're reporting to Mellon right now just kind of the activities, but at the end we hope to have a metric study as well.
I think that in our case, the key thing is really the audience that you're trying to target. So we do very similar things. If we're trying to, for example, try to explain usage of a site that is targeted to a general audience, then we're going to use analytics. When we're trying to explain how a site that is targeted towards an academic audience is used, then yes, we use DOI, citations, and sometimes when those are not available or because of the context in which they're used. For example, one of the projects I'm co-director of focuses on medieval manuscripts, and our user base is extremely small, as you may imagine. So there's literally no way to track that in an automatic, useful way. So we just know who is using it in the field, and when we need to apply for a new grant or explain this, we'll just contact a colleague and say, would you write a letter explaining how you use this resource so that we can use that. So it's an enormous range from something that can be highly automated to writing letters to colleagues asking them to please write a letter for us.
Yeah, I would add that the course adoption is another thing that we've looked at, and part of our marketing has been reaching out to specific faculty about using the books in their courses as well.
So again, ours is a little different. I actually have a follow-up question for all y'all, but for our projects, we actually look at a continuum of data that goes from awareness to impact. So that it looks at first of people who are aware, to those that have used, to then those that have thinking about the impact, who have employed it in some way. So have taken the code, have written about it, cited it in some way, invited to speak. So it's an extension. We actually adopted it from an education journalist, an education publisher model of how they think about their advocacy journalism and the impact of it. And some of the data is easy to get, and some of it needs to be hand curated. It's really hard. The question that I have is one that we've been asking ourselves, and I'm interested in the answers from the other panels, is, so that's what we're tracking, but how do you know what's enough? Like, how do you set those bars? What does that look like?
You don't know what's enough, unless you can anticipate what the need for that data is going to be.
I don't mean what data. I don't mean how much data. I mean, if you're tracking usage,
right?
How much usage is needed
to
justify the value of the tool?
Exactly, and you don't know because you don't necessarily know what you're going to need that usage for. You just mentioned impact. I mean, one of the things we discussed earlier is how all this affects things like the tenure process. And usually the traditional ways to measure impact don't necessarily work very well in the digital context, particularly in certain disciplines where you don't automatically track notions of impact, regardless of how effective it is elsewhere. So you just don't know. And I'm very interested to hear how you're doing it, but it's enormously complicated. You just mentioned source code. We publish all our source code on GitHub. It's all open. And we've been discussing how do you assign authorship to code, and how do you track usage, and could a case be made for that to be used as part of, say, a dossier for tenure review? There are disciplines that are much more advanced in that. Someone mentioned astrophysics out there. They do that already. In history, we barely would count a PDF that is just a scan of something, because that's just a bit too digital. So
I have some comment on that.
Obviously.
We have so many new opportunities to track usage of items. The classic example is your Kindle usage. It's possible to see when do you stop reading, at what point in the book did you stop reading it, who found what interesting in a book. Did you finish it? How quickly did you finish it? Imagine if we could do that with scholarly publications in a scholarly environment, where you could track way more than just citations. You could actually just track attention. The problem is, it also opens a whole can of worms in terms of ethical questions. Should we be doing this? What kind of privacy models are we not taking heed of? And so it's a very tricky thing where we have to balance what is enough and what is too much. And the gut feel from a technical point of view is you track everything because you can, but just because you can do something, should you be doing it?
We've had some success with tracking percentages of growth. Not only of users, people that view the content, how many views, how many downloads, but also how many faculty have contributed, how many scholars have contributed, how many papers are there now. And then we also, on top of that, and those numbers always go up. I mean, we're not going to be subtracting papers out of this. So that's always going to go up, and it always looks good. But the other part of it is we have biannually, or every 2 years, we have an author's forum where we get faculty, and like the letters you were talking about, where you get letters from faculty, we have the faculty actually have a forum talk about how the digital scholarship, the Center for Digital Scholarship helped them and what it's meant for them. And those have been incredibly, it turns out our current dean was the first one of our speakers 4 years ago. And now he's dean for the whole university. So it's politically and administratively and financially been very good for us to do those things. And that's how we measure success. And as long as we keep everybody excited and to agree that, yes, we're successful, then we are.
Okay, thank you. I think this is gets us to the end of the session. I think we could probably have talked a lot longer. Thank you very much to our panelists. And thank you also for contributing and coming to listen to us. Thank you.